Let me say at the front, as with the original film, for simplicity, I will refer to the original film and monster with the name Godzilla rather than Gojira, as some feel it should be pronounced. But the reason we have to even consider it is because Godzilla was such a massive hit. It was so impressive that a sequel was inevitable. But, appropriate given how King Kong helped eventually lead to Godzilla, this sequel seemed to face the same problem. The monster dies at the end of the film, and also, the special effects for the monster aren't something that you can produce quickly. Kong's sequel was Son of Kong, rushed out less than a year after King Kong, and it showed. While it did alright at the box office, the reviews were decidedly negative. But despite this precedent, Toho decided on the same thing. A new monster, just like the old one, turns up for the same reason, and let's try to get the film done quickly. Gone were the days when Tsuburaya's drive for meticulous artistry would be indulged, when one camera operator misunderstood directions and shot a scene exactly the opposite of how it was supposed to be, fast motion rather than slow motion. Tsuburaya could only grind his teeth and put the scene in the movie anyway. But the Godzilla sequel actually had its origin in a far stranger place, and it was thanks to a new type of film that was popular in Japan at the time, Invisible Man films. It was actually kicked off years earlier, thanks in part to the special effects wizardry of Tsuburaya, for a film called Enter the Invisible Man. This film involved jewel thieves interested in using an invisibility formula that a scientist is working on in order to help them steal extremely valuable and well-protected gems. And it would prove to be the template for this new blend of science fiction and noir. Film historian David Callett describes it as, quote, a template of crazy mismatched ingredients. Mad scientists, criminal thugs, nightclub dancers, circus clowns, and people who fade away. Now, how this hodgepodge fits in has to do with the presence, or lack thereof, of Ishiro Honda, director of the original Godzilla film, who likewise seemed to have vanished into thin air. Now, if I were to ask you to name a Japanese film director, the name that would most likely leap to mind is that of Akira Kurosawa, whose works are actually much more famous outside of Japan than they are within it. And I bring him up because he and Honda were both protégés of Katsura Yamamoto. Of the two, he said they represented the two kinds of people that come from Tohoku. Quote, one is like Kurosawa. He's the type that challenges the natural order. On the other hand, Honda fits himself into the natural order. That's why Kurosawa's films are always about battles, relationships, love, human feelings, and so on. But what Honda wants to show in his movies is harmony in the relationship between nature and man. Yamamoto, in fact, created the film that had gotten Tsuburaya in trouble later on, The War at Sea from Hawaii to Malaya, which showed a recreation of Pearl Harbor's attack that was so realistic people thought that it had to be actual footage. But given the description by Yamamoto, it's no surprise that when Honda co-created the original Godzilla with Takeo Murata, he put a great deal of emphasis on the human aspect of the tale. And it's also no surprise that Toho thought he might be better suited to other types of movies than monster ones. He would still go on to do some monster movies for them that had already been planned, but they were going to try to steer him in a different direction. Many Japanese critics were confused by Godzilla, which tried to be something far more than what one would imagine from a monster film. So he was off to do the movie The Abominable Snowman when the decision was made to create a sequel to Godzilla, and so another director was going to be required. But, while Kurosawa and Honda are both the most famous of Yamamoto's protégés, there was also another who grew into his craft under the watchful eye of one of Japan's most famous early directors. This man was Motoyoshi Oda. By no means famous, but nevertheless part of this Japanese film community. He worked under Honda himself on the film Eagle of the Pacific, a film intended to challenge Hollywood with its epic, big-budget war pictures. Oda was a special effects director on that film, and for one scene, it called for a Japanese Zero and its pilot to catch on fire. The stuntman was Haru Nakajima, who had been previously known for his stunt work in samurai films. But his work so impressed Honda that he was cast in the title role for Godzilla. Well, his work on that film so impressed Tsuburaya that he would become an invaluable asset in his films. Whenever a kaiju film, as these giant monster movies were being called for a man in a suit, Tsuburaya went looking for Nakajima. The two became friends, and when Tsuburaya passed away, Nakajima retired from suit acting, as it was called. Nakajima's role might not seem like it was terribly important for an actor, but that was only because he made it look so easy. When originally cast in the role of Godzilla, Nakajima understood that the monster had to seem like it was a living thing that was driven by instincts. It wasn't a robotic engine of destruction. And so he studied large creatures at the zoo to note how they moved. The kaiju fandom mourned last year when he passed away at the age of 88. But while he was mostly known for his monster portrayals, it was during this time after Godzilla that he links back up with Oda. Remember that crazy Invisible Man style that I mentioned earlier? Well, Oda was the director for the film called simply The Invisible Man, or as it was called in English, The Invisible Avenger, which featured Nakajima in it. Now, this movie combined horror with Yakuza-style gangster films, as the criminals blame a string of illegal activities on a soldier who was experimented on during the war and consequently has invisibility. It was good enough to get a sequel in its own right. Vapor Man meets the Human Fly. And it was cemented in Toho's mind that its growing collection of science fiction films was a lucrative investment for them. And with Invisible Man's success, the decision was made to give Oda the job of directing the Godzilla sequel. One can argue the artistic successes of that film, but what cannot be debated is that it was profitable. And Oda by now had gotten a reputation for quickly cranking out cheap, profitable films. Invisible Man just proved that he could do that with science fiction films as well, and so there was a good chance he could do it with Godzilla. Tsuburaya, who did the effects on that film, although with a less is more approach, would be vital to this sequel. So Honda, who naturally needed Tsuburaya's wizardry for the abominable snowman, found himself unable to do the sequel and unable to finish his own film. Honda eventually turned to making the film Mother and Son, an example of one of those more human tales that I referred to earlier. As for Tsuburaya, he needed to bring in a whole new Godzilla. He discovered, unfortunately, that the material used to make the suits decayed quickly in storage. And since these things took a beating during filming anyway, it was better to just rebuild the suit than try to save the old one. This is in fact how it would go. In fact, it wasn't until the partial reboot in 1984 that a suit would be made that could actually be used from movie to movie. This new suit was going to require even greater durability and flexibility, because in this movie it was decided that Godzilla was going to fight a second monster this time. It was an ankylosaurus, likewise mutated by radiation from atomic testing. Now, up until now, I have done my best to try to pronounce the Japanese names correctly. But here is where I draw the line. The name of this monster is not consistent, not only between the English and the Toho versions, but also between the various English versions and the various Toho versions. How to actually pronounce this is no doubt known by many fans, but there is a line to even my research. It will be referred to solely as that new monster. Oda brought over practically all of his crew from Invisible Man, including screenwriter Hidaka, who worked with Murata to pull together the script as quickly as possible. Segments were brought over from Invisible Man in their entireties. In fact, the climax of that film turns into a major event for the Godzilla sequel. So while the original film had been an allegory for the threat of the atomic bomb, the sequel was instead going to be an allegory for living in a time of war. Godzilla threatened destruction, and one could only hope that he wouldn't strike, and when he did, pick up and move on elsewhere. And while that's an interesting idea to explore, the absence of Honda and his humanizing approach made the human drama less effective than the original film. The rush production certainly didn't help matters either. The citywide blackout harkens back to the days of the war, when this was done to avoid bombings by the Allied planes, and the need to rebuild and move on was the state that Japan found itself in after the war. These are all fine allegorical elements. But in the rush script, the impact of these events are severely diminished. The Emperor's speech to his people after the war included a line that would serve as a kind of motto for the rebuilding Japanese society. Endure the unendurable and suffer what is not sufferable. Yet the story, which wanted to get to as much action as possible, took this to such an extreme that, rather than seeing them emerging from the crisis through collective Japanese strength of will, they just kind of shrugged it off, as if having gigantic prehistoric monsters demolishing your cannery is the same as someone parking in your parking space. This would have a significant impact on the film's eventual arrival in the United States, under the title Gigantus the Fire Monster. The name change caused many to speculate that the rights to the name Godzilla had actually been tied up in the first film. But in fact, many members of the team that handled Godzilla King of the Monsters were involved in this new American film. As with the original, they wanted to dub the film and include some American inserts to allow the US audience to better connect with the film. As I said in regards to Godzilla King of the Monsters and Godzilla 1985, the original film's transformation may seem like sacrilege today, but at the time, it was actually a sign of respect. However, when they saw Godzilla Raids again, the less effective human drama of the work caused them to change their plans. They were so unimpressed by this aspect that they decided to instead keep the special effects and build a new film around them. This was actually the unintended consequence of the changes to Godzilla King of the Monsters. American studios were buying these special effects films from Japan, chopping them up, and making new movies out of them. In fact, Honda's Abominable Snowman would be retooled into a film called Half Human and star John Carradine. So they picked up the rights through the company American Broadcasting Paramount Theaters Pictures Corporation, shortened to the more manageable ABPT. It was to be called The Volcano Monsters, about two ancient monsters found in a volcano and brought to San Francisco for study, where they get loose and wreak havoc. Why San Francisco? The city was known for its Chinatown, and so it was reasoned 1950s Americans wouldn't know the difference between it and a Japanese city. And being 50s America, they probably were right. But as the scriptwriters were tallying the new shots they would need, they knew that there would be some new shots even of the monsters required. So a deal was struck with Toho to send over the suits for Godzilla and the new monster to film the new footage. Now you might have said, wait a minute, you said it was Gigantus the Fire Monster, and then you said it was the Volcano Monsters. Which is it? Well, it was supposed to be the Volcano Monsters, but ABPT ran into trouble and found itself out of business, and its assets were liquidated and the film rights were up for sale. In fact, during the confusion, Toho's suit for the new monster vanished, and no one knows what happened to it, whether someone threw it out or took it home, or it was made into something else. It remains a mystery to this day. So the rights for Godzilla Raids Again were up for sale, and they were picked up by Paul Schreibman, the same man who had hired Raymond Burr for Godzilla King of the Monsters. Uninterested in the plans for the Volcano Monsters, Schreibman and his team of investors were looking for a way to quickly cash in on the film. So, the only rewriting allowed this time was whatever could be dubbed or re-edited. Nothing new could be shot. This Gigantus the Fire Monster was both too faithful and not faithful enough. Not faithful in that many aspects of it were changed through the dialogue, including pointless narration or irrelevancies that were being introduced to try to market it to the late 50s as somehow being related to the fears around outer space, as was common in science fiction at the time. But then, they would go on to translate the Japanese words exactly as they literally were, so that idioms would no longer make any sense. Perhaps the best example being an explanation of how the hero isn't as brave as his fiancée thinks, by telling her, banana oil. The actors dubbing the film were soon laughing at their own script. It also didn't help that, while Key Luke, considered one of the first true Asian stars in America, and George Takei, eventually famous as Sulu on Star Trek, were both performing major roles, but the role of Kobayashi went to Dawes Butler, who was at the start of a career for Hanna-Barbera. This was especially a problem because Dawes would frequently give Kobayashi the voice that he would later use for Yogi Bear.
I have a picture right here. No, you can't see that.
Needless to say, Gigantus failed to be as respectful towards its source material as King of the Monsters had been. It was placed on a double bill with Teenagers from Outer Space, a film that was featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000, to give you an idea of the view of the studio itself towards this movie. The deal was made with both Warner Brothers and Bill Foreman, president of Pacific Theaters, who was so unenthused that when the rights to Gigantus were transferred to him, no further effort was made to show it in America in either the theaters or on television. Godzilla Raids Again, on the other hand, was the fourth highest box office of the year in Japan, and ensured that the monster series would go on. So, let's take a look at Godzilla Raids Again.